The perfect but realistic offseason for the Pelicans. I'll tell you why Trae Young is the move, who they should draft, the surprising free agent signings, and the other big internal move the Pels need to make this offseason. It's the Friday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Friday, final show of the week, and I'm going to give you my ideal, perfect, but also realistic offseason that if the Pelicans do all of this, I will be thrilled, and I think they'll be title contenders next season. We're going to somewhat remake the team in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this team. This is going to be a fun show. So tell a friend about it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What is your perfect offseason? I even have a salary cap spreadsheet pulled up on one of the monitors here. We're going to get into that for you cap nerds. That'll be in the second segment of today's show. But let's start with this. The big move, the one that kind of is what your offseason hinges on, and that's Trae Young. Trae Young is the trade. You know, there are concerns about him, yes, but I feel like it is realistic. You know, Donovan Mitchell's not being traded. De'Aaron Fox is not happening. Murray from the Atlanta Hawks doesn't move me. There's a lack of those type of players that you think really elevates this team, and we're kind of going to go on the assumption that this team is trading Brandon Ingram. Yes, Trae Young has faults, but would you rather give Brandon Ingram a max deal? If we're under the assumption, Mark Stein said this in his Substack newsletter, which is worth paying for, that it's like an inevitability that Brandon Ingram is gone, we're going to send him out. So we're sending him out for Trae Young. So here's the trade. The trade is Brandon Ingram and Jose Alvarado, which kills me to say, for Trae Young. You can include a pick on the Pelican side, maybe that next year's Laker pick, you know, particularly if they get Dan Hurley, something like that, which maybe is a better coach than JJ Redick. That is, I think, the trade. I don't think you need a ton more draft compensation in there either, given that, you know, kind of both these players maybe need a change of scenery. One thing I'm not including in this deal is the 21st overall pick. I think that is actually really important for the Pelicans this year. So Trae Young, and this, and more on it in the third segment, allows you to make a bigger shakeup to the starting lineup. So Ingram and Alvarado for Young and some draft picks from the Pelicans probably going that way. You know, look at Brandon Ingram in the postseason. Just wasn't defended in the way that we would have liked to have seen. Maybe he was hurt. That's kind of going around a little bit too, but it was a disappointing showing. There's no getting around that. And we saw kind of some clunkiness with Zion Williamson this year. The fit with Trae Young is absolutely there. That is not something that I'm really worried about whatsoever when it comes to those two on the court. Trae Young is actually, when you look at his numbers, not a particularly like elite shooter or anything like that. We think of him like that, and that's important. We think of him as an elite shooter, but when you look at his numbers for his career, they're rather pedestrian in terms of three-point percentage. Last year was 37.3%. The year before that was 33.5%, then 38%, 34, 36, and something just happened when I was recording. That was super weird that everything just went blank, and I'm sorry about that, and hopefully I didn't capture it. So you look at his, I don't know what just happened. I'm also running off of a new laptop, so if the audio sounds a little bit different, I'm still trying to dial it in. Maybe that would be why. So the shooting numbers aren't incredible, but the volume is good. 8.7 attempts per game last season. His second year in the league, he took almost 10 attempts from three. So while he's not making those threes at the highest rate, like never above 40%, his court gravity is going to create space for Zion. It's going to create space for others on this team. And this is a guy for his career who's averaged 25.5 points per game and 9.5 assists. You want someone that can dish the ball, create for others, and that's what you need. Trae Young is capable of doing that. And because he's shooting on such high volume, he has three seasons where he's made over 3 made three-pointers per game. Those are really good numbers and what you need next to Zion Williamson. So I'm willing to look past some of the other issues with him. But you can also address some of those issues. And I think the big thing is the defense. He's a bad defender. Last year, he tried on the defensive side of the ball and was not good on that side of the ball. The Atlanta Hawks have never had a good defense when he's been out there on the court. There's no getting around it that he is a bad defender. You could say he's almost an atrocious defender. I also think that's okay. I don't think one player is going to tank the defense. I don't think CJ McCollum is an elite defender or anything like that. More on CJ in the third segment here. So I think you can get away with it. But I also think that if you know he's a bad defender, you can tool your roster and make other moves that take that into account. It's going to start in the draft. We'll talk about that in a second here. But he also hasn't had defenders around him like Herb Jones. Zion becoming a good defender this year. If they get the right center that gives you defense too, that changes things. Scheme matters too. And if you give him a real rim protector, and Okongwu is not a rim protector, Clint Capella is like somewhat of a rim protector, but kind of not in the same vein that some of these other guys that we're going to look at in the next segment are. I think that maybe changes things. And also with him coming to New Orleans and kind of being the second option to Zion Williamson, maybe that gives him more energy to commit on the defensive side of the ball. That is often a thing. So I'm willing to not look past it. Defense matters. Anyone who tells you it doesn't is incorrect on this. You still need to retain some defense. Look at the teams in the NBA Finals. They're playing good defense. Boston being up there and the Dallas Mavericks kind of having a new commitment to that post-trade deadline. The defense definitely matters. But you have a little bit of wiggle room to kind of balance the offense and the defense a little bit more. And I like Trae Young to give you just a huge injection of offense and a lead guard to really run this team and play alongside Zion Williamson with a fit that's just better. And if you know what his faults are, what his issues are, you can plan for that. And it starts in the draft and with other positions in free agency too. Let's look at that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Right now, though, I'm excited to tell you about Prize Picks because Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You pick more or less on 2 or more players' stats projections for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With Prize Picks, you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds, and you need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 players' stats projections, and you're locked in. I think Kyrie Irving is going to have a real big series. I'm going to take more on 25.5 points for him in game 1 that's about to start in the NBA Finals. So when the finals are over, hoops action doesn't stop on Prize Picks. Women's basketball is just getting started, and with young stars like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese looking to make names for themselves alongside greats like Breanna Stewart, you could win up to 100 times your cash just by watching them ball out here. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That is a first deposit match up to $100 when you go to prizepicks.com and use code LOCKEDONNBA or download the app. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube and let me know what your ideal Pelicans offseason is. Is it a Trae Young trade? Is it another trade? Let's be a little bit realistic here. Donovan Mitchell, I don't think it's going to end up happening, but that would be great. But we're looking at realistic moves, things that we think could happen. For your second listen, you watching Fox Sports, ESPN on your TV all day long? Are you watching places that aren't talking sports or just joking around? Do you have to turn down the volume with all of that yelling? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into the draft and free agency. And I have a cap sheet up right now that I keep and made some alternate ones to kind of figure out what it would look like when we get into free agency in the draft. Because when you're making trades, the money matters. And so when I looked at a Trae Young trade, I tried to really find a way to get Clint Capella or Onyeka Okongwu here in New Orleans. And the money doesn't work. Because one of the things is, I don't know if they truly want to move on from Larry Nance Jr. just yet, or if they really like him as that kind of backup small ball five that you wouldn't have otherwise. So without that, without basically some of the criteria that I kind of put in here was looking at this offseason was going no more than up to $5 million into the luxury tax, factoring in the salary of the 21st overall pick. You know, there's a hard cap situation that they run into in my dream offseason too, which actually isn't a big deal, so don't worry about it. So you need to kind of factor those things into this as well. So that's why you didn't get back Clint Capella or Okongwu in this, and you still have Larry Nance Jr. on this team. So that means you need to figure out the center position. And I think it starts in the draft. I said in that Trae Young deal, we are not sending out the 21st overall pick. And I don't think Atlanta would want that either. With the number 1 overall pick, I don't think they want 2 rookies like that in a weak draft. So first thing you need to do in the draft is draft a center. And I don't particularly care which one. I do, that's a lie. There's a couple of names, right? Zach Edey, Kel Ware, Kyle Filipowski, Yves Missi. One of them is going to be available. If Edey is there at 21, I'd take him. I'd absolutely take him. I know he's not a stretch big. I think that's okay. Rim protection is going to be important. With Trae Young being not good on the defensive side of the ball, you actually need rim protection because he's going to get beaten. And it's going to force the Pelicans to change their defensive scheme a little bit. They don't like to play drop coverage. They like to switch on the perimeter. Edey can switch on the perimeter, but you also want him hanging back towards the basket a little bit, being that shot deterrent, which is going to make life a little bit easier for someone like Trae Young, because even if guys get by him, they're running into Zach Edey down low, and I don't think that's something that they particularly want to do. So Edey, Ware, Missi, Filipowski. I'm forgetting Deron Holmes II. My order would probably be Edey, Ware, Holmes is what I would think. And then Filipowski or Missi. But this center that you're drafting isn't your starter. They're likely not going to be ready for that, at least at the beginning of the season. You obviously hope they can have a Derek Lively II kind of impact and maybe be a starter later on in the year. So you need to sign one in free agency because you're not starting Larry Nance Jr. And that leads to the first free agent move as well. So you draft a center, and then you go and you sign Mason Plumlee from the Clippers. He's going to be a free agent this year. He's someone I've talked about actually in the past on the show. You need someone who's serviceable enough and can soak up 20-ish minutes a night. He's serviceable and he's going to be cheap. And this is where you start to really look at things. So this is where I'm going to pull up the cap sheet and we can get a little bit nerdy with some of the numbers here. The roster right now before this offseason is Zion, Ingram, McCollum, Herb, Larry, Dyson, Trae, Hawkins, JRE, Matt Ryan, EJ Liddell, Jose Alvarado, and then the 21st overall pick. That total salary comes to $157.7 million. The luxury tax threshold is $171. That gives them, rough math here, it's actually not rough, this is pretty exact, $38,000, right? Basically $13.67 million or so from the luxury tax threshold. After the trade, and that's including the 21st overall pick. So that means basically you could spend the mid-level exception, which is right around $13 million to sign one player, 2 players, and that would be that. After a Trae Young deal, where your roster, where you send out Brandon Ingram and bring in Jose Alvarado for Trae Young, and then you draft a center, let's say it's Kel Ware because I think that's realistic, then you sign Mason Plumlee for a maybe $5 million deal, and then you use the rest of your mid-level exception on a guy like Monte Morris, who I think would be a guy that they could go for, another backup guard. And that gives you a total salary of $174.735 million. That's into the luxury tax, $3,390,000. And then you still have room to the first apron because you're hard capped at that with $4 million in room. Basically, when there's for the mid-level exception, which is what the Pelicans are using to sign guys, the way you operate in the offseason is you're an over-the-cap team or you're a cap room team. There's very few cap room teams in the NBA. So if you're over the cap, you don't have space to sign guys, money to sign guys. You have to rely on exceptions. The most common of these is the mid-level exception. There are 3 of them. There's something called a room mid-level exception if you have salary cap space. Pelicans don't, so that's out. Then there's the non-taxpayer mid-level exception and the taxpayer mid-level exception. If you use the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which to make them numbers easy is $13 million, and you can split that up on one player or multiple players, and the taxpayer mid-level exception is about $5 million. So this is more money to spend. It hard caps you at something called the first apron. So you have the luxury tax, the first apron, then the second apron. And that is almost always how it works in the NBA. So if you use that full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, you are capped at the first apron. Hard capped sounds scary. You can't spend more money. It doesn't matter. They were never going to reach that amount anyway. The first apron is $178,655,000. They're never going to get close to that number. That's $7 million more than the luxury tax line. For this exercise here, I think the Pelicans might go into the luxury tax $5 million. They won't go beyond that, I don't think. So when creating trades, when signing guys, I was keeping that number kind of as the benchmark here. So trading for Trae Young, signing Mason Plumlee, signing Monty Morris, drafting a center keeps you right under about $4 million under that first apron, which means you still have the ability to make some moves later down the line, and I think that's important. So right now, the roster stands at Zion Williamson, Trae Young, CJ McCollum, Herb Jones, Larry Nance Jr., Dyson Daniels, Trey Murphy, Jordan Hawkins, Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, Matt Ryan, EJ Liddell, Mason Plumlee, Monty Morris, and let's say Kel'el Ware for this exercise because I don't think Edey is going to be available there at 21. I don't hate that roster. That's, I think, a big enough shakeup, and there's more coming in a minute too because the Pelicans in this exercise and what we're talking about aren't done making moves. So that's kind of the salary cap side of it. I think Mason Plumlee can give you 20 minutes a night. And if his role gets reduced as the season goes on because Kel'el Ware is ready, or Edey, or Misi, or someone else, that's a great problem to have because you're going to let him expire at the end of the year. Or you could then trade him at the trade deadline. Now, you need to include other draft compensation with that. More on that in the next segment here because the Pelicans do need to make a move to go and acquire some of that. So you could trade him later if your young guy develops well. Otherwise, your center rotation is probably going to be Plumlee, Larry Nance Jr., and then slowly integrating your rookie center to get him some minutes. And you need a commitment from Willie Green that he's going to play that guy because it's going to be important later. Because Plumlee doesn't give you rim protection. Larry Nance Jr. doesn't give you rim protection. If you have Trae Young and need rim protection, you need this center to really work out. This is the risk with trading for a guy like Trae Young. Now, you signed Monty Morris to kind of replace Jose Alvarado off the bench. I think you're kind of, Dyson we've seen is not really that point guard of the future. I think he's kind of looking a little bit more like a wing, though the movement still looks good, but the rebounding and size and defense is still there, so you want him. But Monty Morris is a good three-point shooter, even if he doesn't do it in large volume. He's someone you trust, and he's going to be available because he had a bad series against the Dallas Mavericks, was basically a non-factor for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Only playing in one of those games and then was not good against the Denver Nuggets. That's what I mean. In that series right before, kind of lost his spot. But this is a guy who's a career 39% shooter from 3 on 3 attempts. Plays pretty good defense too. Just a solid, cheap backup point guard that I think gives you a little bit of insurance at times. And I think that's kind of important for this team to have. So Trae Young, Monty Morris, Mason Plumlee, Kel'el Ware being added to this roster. But there's a bigger move that's kind of an internal one, and it involves CJ McCollum. Let's talk about that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell a friend about the show as well. Get them watching it here on YouTube with over 10,000 Pelicans fans. It's going to be a fun offseason. We're getting into what the ideal offseason is. We're going to keep it going here. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. For your second listen, Ross Jackson over at OTAs for the Saints, wrapping up this week. Everything you need to know, black and gold, and what it's going to mean for next season. And the offense is looking kind of good. He's going to be telling you why over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make that your second listen today. So we are looking at the Pelicans' idealized offseason. We're spending some money. We got him into the luxury tax, not a ton, under $4 million. That seems good, with a little bit of wiggle room too. You have about $4 million or so to kind of play with because you can get up to the first apron. And I think that's an important thing. That means that maybe you trade a guy like Mason Plumlee if your rookie center really starts to work out. You also have two unguaranteed deals in Matt Ryan, who they could waive. And then Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, they have a team option that they can choose to pick up or not. That clears about a little over $4 million too. If you get rid of them though, and sign like one person or spend more money, you've got to keep in mind that you still need to fill out your roster. This kind of new roster we've made with Trae Young on here has 15 guys on the Pelicans, 14 guys on the Pelicans. You can have 15. I'm keeping one roster spot open. That seems like something they like to do, and that gives you a little bit of future flexibility. So that's why we're doing something like that. So they're into the luxury tax, under $4 million, and still have kind of $4 million to play with if they need to add more because something comes up at the trade deadline. Say something does come up at the trade deadline. Let's look at a best case scenario. Kelly Ware is ready to start. He's going to be your big man starting. You'll have Larry Nance Jr. off the bench to go with that kind of small ball, but he gives you rim protection. Maybe his three-point shot is worked out, and Kelly Ware is just a revelation here in New Orleans. We would love something like that. So you want to move on from Mason Plumlee. The problem the Pelicans have is they don't really have second-round picks. They have one that they can trade once the draft is over. That is not an ideal position to be in. Those have increased in value we've seen recently, just due to the way the new collective bargaining agreement puts things in place, how you can kind of sign those guys for cheaper. And for a lot of these, second apron teams or even first apron teams that have some limits on team building, you need second-round picks just to draft guys to have a roster. Just to have people who can breathe out there on the NBA court. So getting extra second-round picks is an important move. So in this scenario, we've traded one future first-round pick. Doesn't matter what it is. What the Pelicans also need to do this offseason is trade another future first-round pick or pick swap for additional seconds. The Phoenix Suns did this where they traded a first-round pick swap with the Memphis Grizzlies, saying, you get the better of our picks here. We each get a first-round pick, but you get the better one. This went into effect with the Pelicans and the Bucks this year, where the Pelicans moved from 23 to 21st in the draft because the Bucks finished worse than them. So when you look at it like that, you still retain a first-round pick, but you get additional second-round picks for doing that swap. And I think that is something that's worth doing for New Orleans. Trade a first-round pick swap way down the line and bring back 2, 3, 4 second-round picks. I don't want second-round picks in this draft. I want future second-round picks. I would even be willing to trade a first-round pick, lottery protected, for like 4 or 5 second-round picks if you could get something like that. They need to rebuild that war chest of those assets, something that they are lacking, including 4 second-round picks in that trade to dump Devontae Graham and bring in Josh Richardson, hurt them. Not an ideal situation. You need those picks back because that's likely how you're going to make, a kind of tweak, which I think they'll need to do or want to do at the trade deadline this coming year. So that's one of the moves that they need to make. The bigger one is you need to bring CJ McCollum in off the bench. I don't know if you can have a CJ McCollum and Trae Young, too many Trays on the team now, backcourt. That's not great defensively. It's undersized. That worries me, I'll be honest, because the way I envision trading for Trae Young is you start Trae Young, you start Herb Jones, you start Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and Mason Plumlee in this scenario. And then your bench is CJ, Dyson, Hawkins, Ware, Nance, and Monte Morris. That's kind of what I envision. It's 11 guys. I like that. I think that's okay. You kind of whittle that down as the season goes on. Maybe Morris isn't needed. Maybe Plumlee isn't needed as it goes in the future. Maybe Dyson just doesn't play well. Who knows what it is? But I think you can start with an 11-man rotation. But I think when you have a starting lineup of Trae Young, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and Mason Plumlee, and Plumlee's going to get pulled pretty quickly either for Ware or Nance, that gives you enough defense, I think. Zion's been good on that side of the ball. Herb is there. If you sub in Ware and he is a rim protector, or Edey, right, that gives you defense too. You can get Dyson out there sooner rather than later and then let CJ cook with those second units. And I like that, right? Trae isn't an amazing defender yet and has struggled at times with that. But the size is at least a deterrent. And so adding size, even if it doesn't come with like great defense attached to it, is at least a starting point for kind of having some balance on that unit because, yes, defense does matter. So that's the way I kind of envision things. The other two big moves, right, are getting second-round picks and moving CJ McCollum to the bench. The idea, you still have shooting in that starting lineup. Trae's going to give you a lot of shooting. Both Traes are going to give you a lot of shooting. And Herb is serviceable. That's enough. That's 3 shooters right there. That'll work. You can even sub in CJ. But, if your starting lineup was Trae Murphy, CJ McCollum, Herb Jones, Zion, and Plumlee, I think that's fine. But I like the idea of getting Trae and Herb out there and having Trae's length out there, which can potentially help with rebounding too, because he got better at that as the season went on. Then you sub in Hawkins, Dyson, depending on whether you need shooting, whether you need defense. You have Ware and Nance that give you different looks at center. There's a lot of flexibility here for this team to throw a variety of different looks out there on the court and to adjust as the season goes on. And I think that's kind of the important thing for them. They can adapt to, any situation, and there's some flexibility with the roster here that you don't need to rigidly stick by anything if it proves it's not working. So that's my ideal offseason. You trade for Trae Young. CJ McCollum moves to the bench and you put in Trae Murphy as the starter. You sign Mason Plumlee and Monty Morris, and then you draft a center. Edey, Ware, Filipowski, Misi, Holmes would be good too, any of those guys, and hope that they really develop and can be very impactful for you this season. And it seems like they could, especially if you bring them on slowly and give them a proper ramp up. You need buy-in from the head coach with that. Another little side part of this would be also that you retain James Borrego and see what they can come up with his offense, because he was highly regarded with this, and it doesn't sound like he's going to be going to the Lakers anymore due to a last-minute twist. So we'll see how it goes. Let me know do you like this plan? Do you have a different offseason plan that you'd like to see the Pelicans do? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube, because that's going to do it for this week of Locked On Pelicans, this episode of Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Enjoy the NBA Finals. I know I will be. We're back on Monday. Deep draft dives on a lot of other prospects, because while we're saying big man a lot, there's other directions the Pelicans could go, especially if they address the center position through the trade market or other ways. So we got a lot to come on those kind of guys, including some trade up targets for the Pelicans. That's coming up next week on Locked On Pelicans. So I appreciate y'all watching. See y'all on Monday.